Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast where we'll be discussing energy as a service, the most common legal and document structures for these transactions and why they make sense, and more. I'm Danielle Fagese, and I'll be your moderator today. We have a great lineup of speakers for you and a lot of information to get through, so I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to just quickly remind you to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we will get to as many as we can, but you can be submitting them while we're talking. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First up, we have Charles Cardall, a partner with Orrick. Chaz is located in the San Francisco office and focuses his practice on municipal finance, tax, and nonprofit corporation tax matters. Next up, joining us, we have Matthew Neuringer. Matt is a partner in Orrick's energy and infrastructure practice. Matthew's practice has a unique focus on the intersection between tax-exempt financing and alternative project delivery methods, such as design, build, energy as a service, and P3s. Next, we have Robyn Helmlinger. Robyn is the leader of Orrick's healthcare finance team and a partner in the San Francisco office of Orrick. For 2 decades, Robyn has been advising issuers, borrowers, and underwriters involved in issuing municipal bonds. Also joining us today, we have Christopher Elmore, Managing Director at Goldman Sachs. Chris joined Goldman Sachs Public Sector and Infrastructure Banking Group full-time in July 2008, and he is co-head of the PSI Transportation P3 Group, focusing on P3 financing and advisory efforts, as well as U.S. municipal and governmental transportation financing. And last but not least, we also have with us today Blake Pinell, a director based in New York with RBC's non-for-profit healthcare investment banking group. Blake's focus areas include energy as a service partnerships, tax-exempt financing, and strategic advisory engagements for healthcare systems. I thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to a great discussion. And with that, I want to turn it over to you, Matt. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here again since our inaugural Energy as a Service tax-exempt financing webinar on March 30, 2023, when this structure was just really a twinkle in our eye. And now it's just so great to come together with this team of people that we've spent the last 9 months closing a handful of these exciting transactions. And what we're going to talk about today is what are energy as a service transactions for those who are not familiar, why do them in the first place, how to deliver them with tax-exempt financing, and considerations from a tax perspective. And when we did this initially, it was actually the Yankees home opener. Today, the Yankees are into Game 3 of the ALCS. So hopefully, again, we don't steal the thunder for the Yankees, but we'll try our best. So here we go. In the MUSH market, which is municipal, universities, hospitals, schools, effectively any owner that has large campuses and energy needs, to enter into a contract with a partner to deliver design, construction, finance, operations, and maintenance services in the energy area. Types of improvements we're talking about are often heating, cooling, HVAC, building automation systems, lighting, as well as renewable energy. And we often see central plants as part of a core feature and function to these types of transactions. What type of capital commitment are owners expected to provide up front? That really depends on the structure, and we're going to get into a handful of different structures. But the idea here is that the private developer is your partner in financing these transactions and should be investing alongside the owner in developing and delivering these assets, which means that the investment upfront should really be to seed and provide pre-development capital to get you to a financial close. And then the developer is there delivering a turnkey solution thereafter. Some of the unique features of these transactions also include, in some instances, the opportunity for an upfront payment and or using upfront payments to create opportunities for energy efficiency and additional scope for projects. Sustainability and resiliency is also a core feature, and partnering with world-class experts to provide redundancy in your systems that might not otherwise be feasible with these structures. So how is it different from a typical ESCO project? Some owners on the call might have experience with ESCOs as well as various advisors. ESCO transactions are actually a component often in these types of projects, but really ESCO transactions are focused more on design and construction as well as guaranteed energy savings with a measurement and verification period to ensure that those guaranteed energy savings are being achieved. But here, you're also adding the finance component, operations and maintenance, and more of a long-term partnership relationship that is focused on risk transfer, an appropriate risk transfer so that both sides have a transaction that works for the long term. And so you'll see risk transfers at the top of why do it. And the idea is healthcare institutions, educational institutions, governmental services providers, they have a core focus and mission that often isn't energy and facilities management. And so this is an opportunity to work with those who this is their focus, this is their core business, and have them maximize opportunities around energy savings, resiliency, and decarbonization, while allowing and freeing up the owner to focus on delivering their core mission to their constituents. As far as utility costs, there's often a question around commodity risk. Most of these transactions still have project owners retaining the commodity risk, so shifting costs in the electricity market, gas market, et cetera. However, when it comes to guaranteeing energy efficiency, guaranteeing performance, these structures are intended to be performance-based. And so to the extent that the assets that have been delivered are not operated and maintained at a level, typically some type of standards of comfort level, as well as expectations around long-term operations and maintenance, if that is not being performed, typically these concession agreements or project agreements will have performance-based compensation that will either fluctuate based on non-performance or will have liquidated damages that can be recouped as a result of non-performance. Blake?
Thank you, Matt, and you set the table perfectly. On page 5, what we wanted to do is just give you some additional color on why energy as a service partnerships are a compelling proposition to many 501c3s and municipal entities. The thought that probably comes to mind for the borrowers, bankers, FAs on the call today is that almost all of these deals are done for highly rated organizations that are not starved for capital. They have ample liquidity, debt capacity, and they've been running their energy assets perfectly well for often decades. So the question is, how do energy as a service transactions benefit these sophisticated entities, the majority of which are AA or single A credits? So to this end, on page 5, we've got what we typically see as the 10 most common transaction drivers that we'll hear from organizations that are bringing these deals for internal approvals. And I think it's really helpful to think about the benefits through 4 different lenses across these organizations within the C-suite. So the CFO, COO, facilities leadership, and a sustainability team if they have one. So just briefly, a couple highlights for each to make it relevant to you, your clients, et cetera. So from the CFO's perspective, this structure, I think it's viewed as an attractive, quote unquote, alternative source of capital for project spend. And it's as opposed to dipping into the investment portfolio, raising incremental senior level debt. In some respects, I think it's viewed similarly from a pool of capital perspective to charitable foundation leases, sale leasebacks, and other real estate monetizations. And additionally, the predictability and oftentimes reduction in forecasted utility facilities costs is valuable. From the COO perspective, to Matt's earlier point, the risk transfer is very meaningful. Many of these organizations, they run their assets very well, but it's not their core business. So it's a compelling opportunity to bring in a highly experienced professional operator and refocus on the core competencies or higher returning initiatives. And asset ownership in many of these cases is still retained by the original facility owner, unlike in sale leaseback. So that's a positive. From the facilities leadership perspective, it's not uncommon for some of the team's capital requests, on an annual basis to get cut due to funding constraints, return profiles, and these partnerships provide isolated funding for these important projects that, otherwise may have been abandoned or just, kind of get pushed to a deferred maintenance item. And lastly, we kind of, from the sustainability side, they're similar in some respects to the facility side in that they've got tangible decarbonization objectives, and it takes significant capital to meet them. And it's a compelling funding vehicle to fund these projects outside of the normal budgeting, cycle. And it comes additionally packaged with engineering expertise and potentially, facilitates tax credits. So to sum it up, it's a partnership and financing model that creates value across the organization for various stakeholders. And that said, in any deal, there's risks, and we'll talk about them on page 11. But before that, I want to turn it to Chris to cover page 6 and 7.
Great. Thanks, Blake. I think what we'll be discussing here is really what happens to transaction structures after those conversations that Blake mentioned at the C-suite around achieving the combination of strategic and financial goals for the organization. And the 3 samples that we indicate here show that there is a broad variety of scope and transaction structure that may all fall within the energy as a service umbrella and are designed to achieve different combinations of goals. So as you can see here, there's a wide variety of scope that may be included in the given transaction, from construction of a new plant, new distribution, taking on existing assets. It may incorporate ECMs, or energy conservation measures, similar to the ESCOs that Matt referenced earlier, that could be incorporated to help reduce the net cost to the owner. It may include combinations around renewable and or resilient sources of energy. And there's a lot of flexibility with respect to the retention or transfer of employees, operating cost risk, and life cycle cost risk. Finally, we see across these different structures the choices based on typically the financial need of the procuring owner institution that may result in large upfront payment that is unencumbered, upfront payments that are immediately reinvested into the energy or utility system, or in some cases are designed to minimize the ongoing cost and may not have a direct upfront payment that is either reinvested or utilized for other uses. Moving on to page 7, we can then look at a more, I would say, generic view of a portion and a few kind of points on the spectrum for structures that can be implemented based on some degree of precedent transactions. And importantly, we have found that there is no one-size-fits-all or best structure within the universe of available options. And instead, many of them have combinations of trade-offs, both strategically and financially, around what will best meet the needs of the owner. On the far left of this page, for example, we highlight the availability payment structure. This allows owners to retain the highest degree of control and performance certainty and transfer typically the highest level of expectation with respect to cost certainty, timing, and quality of the service provision. That structure may provide the most certainty around risks, but also, given the level of control and step-in rights, makes it very challenging to move off balance sheet. As structures move further to the right, the level of control and ownership retained by the existing owner declines, and the operator has more flexibility and around how they manage and run the asset. So for example, they may be able or may need to be able to sell excess capacity to third parties. Similarly, however, in many of these structures, the level of cost certainty being provided may be lower. However, that also avoids a cost premium being paid by the owner in exchange for the certainty. And so I think the largest takeaway from page 7 is that there is a wide variety of structures, and between and among the examples even on this page, they can be further refined to meet the set of needs that come out of the series of discussions that Blake highlighted for achieving the combination of strategic and financial goals. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chaz on page 8.
Great. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. As we're sort of talking about these different possibilities, right? Different structures, different ways that you might fit these things together. One thing that we thought might be useful kind of at this point in the presentation is just to talk quickly about 3 transactions that we've worked on and maybe just talk about what specifically they did. So one of these is the Henry Ford Health transaction. And then to give you a sense of that, Henry Ford Health, a large healthcare entity in Detroit, is building a brand new hospital campus. They needed a utility support element to that, something that you might sort of in the generic sense think of as a central utility plant. And so they went ahead and did what at least I think of as being a more traditional kind of public-private partnership P3 procurement just for that energy facility that was going to need to interface with the larger construction project. So that's what we had there, really a kind of a greenfield, new construction plant that related to a larger project. The Adventist Health transaction sort of came at it from a different perspective. That was really a lot more of what I'd call kind of a modernization and kind of improvement, efficiency improvement type of transaction. And it had the interesting feature that as the work was being done by the party that was really providing the kind of energy services, the sort of private, what you might think of as being the private P3 type company, that that they were scoping out additional improvements that were going to themselves achieve additional savings. And the transaction actually increased in size as we went through it because it was sized more or less in a way where the debt service was expected to be able to be sort of offset by the energy efficiency improvements, the savings from that. And there was a savings guarantee and so forth. This transaction also was at, 30 or 40 different sites in a few different states. So it really was very kind of comprehensive in that sense for the Adventist Health system. And then the third one, in terms of underlying legal structure, was actually similar to, hasn't closed yet, about to close, similar to the Adventist Health transaction, really aimed more at a single higher ed campus. Again, a lot of different energy efficiency improvements and some improvements to existing facilities that were important, central utility plant, chiller type of assets. One of the things that really sets this one apart, you can see that there was a fair amount of taxable debt for it, and that was really aimed at financing a larger solar facility. And we probably could have done that solar on a tax-exempt basis, but the decision was, let's do it on a taxable basis to make sure that we're maximizing the investment tax credits. So this was a sort of direct pay investment tax credit type scenario for the university. So we can just go to the next slide, but those are just three examples of recent transactions that we thought might help round out some of this discussion about the options. Maybe Matt, you're next.
And I'll just sort of finish the thought there, because Chaz is the tax lawyer, just takes it for granted that the linkage between the taxable and the IRA tax credit is readily apparent. But a lot of people are still surprised to find out that if you're financing IRA tax credit eligible improvements with tax-exempt debt, that there's a 15% haircut on the potential 30% IRA tax credit.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of structuring and thought that goes on. And if you look at the EaaS deal as well, the taxable piece was used to finance the renewable energy improvements that were done on the EaaS structure as well. And so it is a thoughtful piece. You've really got to be thinking about it holistically, from IRA to existing tax-exempt assets that were financed with tax-exempt debt. And so to get into the next slide, it really underscores the point about, this is made a few times, that no one size fits all for any particular transaction. Fortunately, there's been dozens of these transactions closed in the market across a variety of different types of owners. And so there are many lessons learned on different ways to deliver them. And to Chaz's point, the sweet spot is to create a structure, whether it be a competitive procurement process, which this process shows a solicitation to encourage number of different proposers to potentially show up and propose either unique concepts, if it's more of a energy efficiency type structure, where you're saying, hey, proposers, come on site, do some initial preliminary investment grade audit reviews, and determine where the maximum energy savings or greenhouse gas emissions reductions might be across our portfolio of assets. Or in the case of Henry Ford, you might say, we know exactly what our asset is that we want procured. We know how it should be delivered from a technical perspective, but we want somebody else to be responsible for designing, constructing, financing, operating, and maintaining that very specific scope. This process and this life cycle affords both of those. It also affords the opportunity for developers to work directly with non-for-profits without a competitive process. And that's where some of the magic that Chaz mentioned before allowed for that accretive scope, is what we called it, so that the owner and developer made a decision that as and when there was additional energy savings, let's reinvest those in more energy improvements, generate more savings until you effectively hit a wall and there weren't any additional energy improvements that could be made that would then generate adequate enough savings that you could then continue to increase the scope. I will say that also pivoting from taxable solution to a tax-exempt financing solution also created an opportunity of additional funding to be able to finance those additional improvements on that project. So you'll see that the life cycle is a very typical procurement and project delivery process: identifying scope, achieving a financial close after negotiating the commercial agreements, commencing construction, achieving substantial completion. And when you have multi-sites, like in the case of Aventus, where you have 35 different sites, 9 different central utility plants, you could have substantial completions at each of the different sites, but then a final project completion and different ramifications for each. But you really need to think about, how does that interplay with any type of guaranteed energy savings, to the extent that you're relying on those guaranteed energy savings for purposes of repaying debt service. Because if you're expecting to get those energy savings in year 3, because your debt service is coming due in year 3, then you need to ensure that there's a time to completion of not only 1, 2, 3, or 4 sites, but the entirety of the project. And then throughout the operations and maintenance period, whether there is a guaranteed energy savings component or not, or it's just more of a guaranteed efficiency rate, you still want to have a process where there is an annual check-in to ensure that that guaranteed efficiency rate or guaranteed energy savings is being achieved. And so traditional measurement and verification under either ASHRAE or IP&BP standards, international protocols for measurement and verification, are often done sort of concurrently with long-term operations and maintenance. And when you're dealing with sort of transfer of existing assets, there you can partner with your developer to say, we know what types of improvements we want to do now to keep these assets in a guaranteed condition and energy efficiency performance for 20, 30 years. But perhaps there might be other assets that aren't included in the scope of the project on day one. And so you can create flexibility in your structure to allow for a partnership process where you come together with your developer during the O&M phase and identify additional scope that you could potentially add into the project at a later date. And to the extent that you have flexibility in your financing documents around additional permitted indebtedness, there could be an opportunity to fold in the financing of those improvements there as well. But the key is, at the end, the handback period, in some instances, the traditional sort of P3 model that Chaz described, you're going to have a guaranteed handback condition. In others, where you're taking over brownfield existing assets, you might not have that unless you have an option as the owner to decide you want to invest in that guaranteed condition at the end. So it really depends on what the owner is looking to achieve, both during construction, during normal O&M, and then at the handback phase. Robyn?
Thanks, Matt. So I think it's pretty clear that everybody you're seeing here and everybody that's talking is a believer in this structure, but we fully acknowledge that we're having these discussions with potential owners looking to enter into these transactions. We have heard a whole host of different objections. And so this is really kind of a quick overview of some of the objections that we've heard. And some of these have already been addressed, but I think it's important to at least touch on each of these. So clearly one of the objections that we hear is, I don't want to lose control. These are critical systems. We need to make sure that we are getting, delivery of energy and delivery of services at all times. And if something happens, that's a big problem. Well, first of all, you're already exposed to a third-party provider. These energy as a service transactions are really, as others have said, are really partnering you with world-class developers and operators who do nothing but work in this space. Moreover, they actually are very incentivized economically to deliver and to perform. So, you really are working with a partner that is much more committed to making sure that services are delivered, that performance is occurring, than you would in other more traditional settings. So, as Chris talked about the different structures, there are ways to retain either more or less control depending upon what an owner's objective is. So it's really, it's a myth that owners lose control of those assets. They really don't. Another myth, why don't I just go out and access the tax-exempt market and finance this based on my master trust indenture? Isn't that a really efficient way to achieve the capital and get the financing to do this? First of all, interestingly, what all of us are observing and experiencing in the market is that the pricing of the bonds that are being sold to finance energy as a service transactions is not really terribly off of what a borrower's traditional master trust indenture secured debt is. So the actual true cost of the bonds and the pricing of the bonds doesn't actually seem to be wildly different in these circumstances. But more important, as you're hearing and as we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about, is there's really a value for money proposition occurring here. As an owner, you are not only, it's not just the pure cost of the financing, but really what are you getting in return? And what you're getting in return here is you're getting life cycle maintenance, you're transferring risk associated with that. And as you kind of step back and do a full and complete kind of what we call value for money analysis of the project, it often is very economically and financially beneficial for owners to kind of take this piece of their operations that might not be core and mission critical to their overall business, and really, partner with somebody, a developer, an operator that can help them maintain that, and as Matt said, achieve energy efficiencies. These transactions are overly complicated. Well, I'm not going to lie to you. They are complex, but they're complex because you have not just the financing component, you really have the commercial side as well. And that's really the papering and the negotiation and the documentation associated with the rights and the remedies and the responsibilities on the commercial side and the delivery of these services. And so the financing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, looks very much like a very traditional financing. The overall process does look a little bit more complex, and there's a lot more paper that gets pushed around because of the documentation of the commercial side. But nonetheless, I'll say as we do more of these, they go quite smoothly. They are going much more quickly, and they really are overall a very efficient way of both financing and procuring these services. So at that point, I think we've kind of covered the myths. As I said, we're the believers, so I'm happy to continue to address any questions that folks may have. But at this point, Blake, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of the benefits, and as in all things, there is a risk profile that will need to be identified and mitigated. And I think first thing to say is that it's important to understand that energy as a service is a category of transactions, and while they solve for similar high-level goals, they can look very different from a commercial perspective and risk perspective, deal to deal. Each operator has a slightly different model and with its own idiosyncrasies. So on page 11, we just listed some of the criteria that we would encourage the folks on the line, if you are in the midst of a energy as a service project, or if you're evaluating potential operators, your options, just something to dig into with your counsel and your advisor as you consider your options. So it's not complete by any means, but it's a handful of focus areas. So on the partnership side, what's the degree of the risk transfer? Which items are capped or uncapped? What exactly are the options for the existing staff? Is the operator bringing in its own team? Will employees be rebadged? Will there be dual reporting? Flexibility around construction contracts to mitigate cost overruns. Importantly, if there's a loss of availability, what are the facility owners' access rights to remedy issues? How would any liquidated damages be calculated? Alignment of incentives. How might excess third-party off-taker revenue be shared? And most importantly, if you do need to exit the partnership, what are the costs for doing so, depending on the circumstances, for cause, convenience, in the event of an acquisition, or otherwise. And then on the financing side, what would the expected bond rating of the specific approach be? Same as the parent, a notch or two below, indicative cost of capital. To Robyn's earlier point, the cost of capital of all three of the recent transactions was excellent. Discussions with about how these transactions have been viewed by the facility owner's specific auditor, balance sheet treatment. And I just say that the Orrick team has done a fantastic job advising their clients on these and many other questions. So please certainly reach out to them to dig in further if you're curious. So if we could move to page 12, I won't spend too much time here. As I mentioned, three tax-exempt energy as a service deals this year. They all did quite well in the market. Just a few takeaways from the largest of the three, which was the $418 million Adventus deal, which closed in June. As the group might be aware, the vast majority of these deals have historically been capitalized in the 4A2 taxable private placement market. So it was a bit of an unknown for the deal teams bringing these structures to the municipal market for the first time really this year. And at least from the RBC perspective, we found the muni buyer base to be extremely diligent in their review, getting up to speed. And I'd say at least 40 different funds at this point have a very strong understanding of the transaction category and are excited to participate in future deals. That said, the covenant package is critical, and you can still expect, I'm sure, an extensive dialogue with accounts as they prep for their committees, since, as I mentioned, each of these deals do look very different. Pricing results were strong, kind of dispelling some of the, I guess, a conventional myth that something that might look like a project finance deal has to price exceptionally wide of the parent organization. Some maturities of the Adventus deal carried an identical yield to a parent level deal that they did 30 days prior. So, good case study that cost of capital should not be a material concern. So, in short, there's broad municipal market appetite for these deals, and depending on the structure, I think they can price at a very compelling level. So, speaking of structure, let me turn it back to Matt to talk about some boxes and arrows in greater detail.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. I don't know if also, Chris, if there was anything you wanted to add as well, just on execution on Henry Ford.
No, thanks, Matt. I think Blake covered it quite well, and notably, as we've been discussing, the package of risk transfer and control differed between the Henry Ford Health and the Adventist Health West transactions, and therefore the relative pricing vis-a-vis the parent entities had similar differences given the different risk profiles that were being negotiated and taken between the owner and the developers, but still found quite strong reception in the market, indicating the flexibility to adapt to the risk profile that best meets the need of the owner.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so here's the structure. It's a traditional project finance structure. Here it is. Wait for it. Layered on with there it is. We spent at least 4 days working on that. Tax-exempt conduit issuer, non-for-profit borrower in the middle, and a 501c3 flow-down entity that has controlling ownership of the non-for-profit borrower. And so we try to create as elegant and as simple and as efficient of a structure as possible, so that the project agreement between the client and the non-for-profit entity is effectively flowed down on a fully back-to-back basis, except for the financing obligations under this project implementation agreement with the developer. And the non-for-profit borrower has an added feature in that, in addition to being able to allow for and catalyze tax-exempt financing with a conduit issuer and bondholders, it also, in many jurisdictions, I think all the jurisdictions that we've done this so far, has also helped with the property tax challenge as well, in that since the contractual counterparty is also non-for-profit, it is considered in most jurisdictions tax exempt for property tax purposes as well. This is a slightly different illustration of the structure, not as fancy without any animations, but Chaz, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about just the flow down in 2017-13 and really kind of any high level expectations folks should have between the distinction of this structure and what they're used to in traditional project finance structure?
Yeah, just really quick. And there's more on this later in the presentation too. But you could see from the prior slide and from this slide, we've kind of inserted in this 501c3 SPV entity, and there's a few reasons for that from a tax perspective. But I think getting away from sort of focusing on that point specifically, the kind of core issue really is that project agreement, or really here on this slide, is that project implementation agreement one that fits within the qualified management contract rules, one that satisfies the safe harbor guidelines under Revenue Procedure 2017-13. Maybe a different way of saying that is, what is it about the tax-exempt structure that forces you to have a different business deal than you would have if you didn't bring in this 501c3 SPV, if you were not trying to achieve a tax-exempt financing solution? And the answer to that question is not a whole lot. I mean, certainly if you were planning on doing a transaction where you had a project agreement of more than 30 years, okay, we need to fiddle around with the term, because we have a maximum 30-year term or 80% of the useful life term to the contracts, and we can work out some things with some renewal options and such to try to get around that. But the core requirements that are different are pretty small. One is that the risk of loss, a earthquake, flood, fire, massive weather event makes the thing unusable. You're always going to be insured, but if the insurance doesn't cover everything, who's on the hook? Well, that needs to be with the project owner, not with, what I'd think of in a traditional P3 circumstance as the project company. That's pretty likely to be the case in these transactions, I'll say, anyways. Another element of it is, okay, well, you're going to have tax covenants and those sorts of promises and ongoing compliance. But you always have that with tax-exempt financing anyways. You could always decide to go taxable. We haven't really seen the need to sort of have tax covenants be a concern with these transactions. I will say that, and it was alluded to in one of the earlier slides, in some of these transactions where we've got energy facilities where we are expecting there to be some sales of excess capacity to third parties. And those may be situations where we're going to have some taxable debt in order to kind of deal with what might be some private use there. And we just kind of work through that. But still, it doesn't really get in the way of the tax-exempt financing. And then the other part of this that is sort of interesting, and maybe it's a little different than the management contract stuff, is, okay, well, we've got this 501 SPV in here as the borrower, so it needs to be the one that's kind of, I'll say, controlling refinancings and getting the savings from refinancings. We can't really share the savings in the way that you might traditionally see that refinancing savings with the project company. But as you back up from it, that's not a great answer from a project company perspective, perhaps, but it's a fine answer for the project owner. So I think there are elements to the tax-exempt financing structure, as people said, yes, it's a bit more complicated, but the sort of changes to general risk transfer, the changes to some of the other things that you might expect to get out of an energy of a service transaction that was taxable, shifting it to tax exempt, you're not losing a lot of that. We are going to get to a slide at the end where we talk a little bit more about economic comparison. So we'll come back to that. But those were the thoughts I had on this, Matt, if you don't think I missed anything.
Oh, no, that's perfect. And I do want to just pick up on something. I got a phone call this morning about, the question of, well, what's the role of the private developer relative to what a traditional P3 structure is? and how do they invest their own capital at risk, which is really a major distinction with the ESCO deals. And you'll see the private developer still owns this developer for-profit SPV, and whatever their ownership investment is into that SPV is effectively their contribution of capital to the project. So
Right.
the 501c3 could finance 90% of the capital improvements of the project, and the private developer could then privately finance with its own capital contribution the remainder. And then that financing is contributed to the developer. And as you can see, the design build contract is below the developer. And so after the tax exempt financing is drawn down, the developer capital can then be used to finish the project. And then as the project is in operations and maintenance, a developer performance fee can be paid to the developer through the project implementation agreement to recognize strong operational performance, which is ultimately how the developer's capital contribution can be recovered with an upside.
Right. Yeah. In effect, a different way of saying that and there's some detail around this, but a different way of saying that in very few words is you can take what might otherwise be a 90% financing, 10% equity investment, taxable P3 structure and make it work just fine here. We're not forced to use a 100% debt structure just to use tax-exempt financing. Some of the transactions that we talked about had 100% debt, but some did not, and there's flexibility on that front too.
Thanks, Jeff. So we covered, fortunately, this slide and the next slide, I think, in a lot of what was just discussed around different tax-exempt considerations. Robyn, anything we missed you want to cover here as far as cost savings or arbitrage yield?
The only piece that I want to, the only piece that I want to reiterate and just make sure is clear, because we are doing this as a tax-exempt financing, Rule 15C212 does become implicated here. So the owner I think it would be tough to conclude otherwise, but I'm not going to say there aren't circumstances, but more often than not, we would reach the conclusion that the owner, even if the owner has virtually no involvement in the financing itself, the owner is nonetheless going to be deemed an obligated person for Rule 15C212 purposes by virtue of the contract that they have and the funds that they are paying to support the overall kind of project itself. So the piece that I do want to say is, an owner is still going to have ongoing continuing disclosure obligation. Date, at least, our conclusion has been that whatever the owner was otherwise doing and reporting with respect to their existing tax-exempt muni debt is satisfactory for purposes of their obligations in connection with this financing. So that's the only piece I wanted to cover here, Matt, but let's keep moving.
Okay. And I'll just note also, on the bankruptcy point, because these are utility services, there can be a view that's taken that under 11 USC 366, it could be considered a utility services contract, and therefore you have sort of preferential treatment from a bankruptcy perspective. And as a result, that strong bankruptcy treatment can help contribute to the efficient execution of the pricing in the market relative to traditional tax-exempt financing. On the execution, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you want to just probably makes sense to talk really quick about PABs and then keep moving on so that we can get to the tax-exempt side?
Go ahead.
So, one of the benefits of the energy as a service transactions is really that, you get away from the private activity bond allocation process. Most nonprofits that I suspect are probably, observing here today don't typically get terribly involved with PABs, but basically a PAB allocation is something that you have to apply for. It expires. The energy as a service transactions don't implicate PAB allocations at all. So there's significant flexibility in terms of sizing, as well as in terms of timing, where you're not needing to meet an allocation or request one. So that's probably the one piece that is important to mention here, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Robyn.
Yeah, I mean, Chaz, you and I have kind of, had an opportunity to deal with this in certain circumstances. You talked a little bit about it earlier. I think the real key here is if you're doing a project that's not a greenfield project, but where you are otherwise contributing toward an energy as a service transaction, existing facilities that have been financed with tax-exempt debt, there can sometimes be a tension related to that. So it is important to pull bond counsel in pretty early to make sure that you can analyze the assets, analyze the history of the financing for those assets, and determine if there are going to be any issues. We worked on a project where there were a number of campuses involved. All the campuses have been financed with tax-exempt debt. Ultimately, it was determined that a couple of those campuses really weren't eligible to be able to participate in this. But nonetheless, I just want to encourage folks to reach out early and make sure that you understand what the universe and what the limitations might be with respect to the assets that you're contributing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is actually very interesting, and again, it sort of maybe turns some of this on its head a little bit, whether you're improving existing assets or removing some assets and replacing them, or doing things that relate to existing facilities that have tax-exempt financing on them, you've got the issue that Robyn's describing. Of course, if you set up your energy as a service transaction to be able to be a tax-exempt transaction, then it ought to be the case that you do not have any private use of those existing facilities that are financed with existing bonds. So one of the benefits you get from going down this tax exemption road on the new transaction is you probably remove a lot of headaches in terms of tax compliance with respect to any old transactions. And of course, the opposite's true. If you went with a taxable structure, I think one of the things you might be saddled with is dealing with, okay, well, what are our existing facilities? What did we finance with our existing bonds? Do we have to take some remedial action, do something else to deal with tax compliance there? So there is a nice synergy on that front as it relates to existing facilities.
And one other quick observation, I know Robyn will hit on some of this on our next slide as well, but we've found part of the critical pieces of the analysis is both that tax lens of existing debt, but then also the kind of indenture lens of the existing debt. So you might be okay from a tax perspective, but your indenture requires you to take it out. And sometimes you're okay for your indenture perspective, but not from a tax. So ensuring you're asking both of those questions has been quite critical.
Yeah, for sure. That's right.
Chris, that was a perfect tee up. Thank you. There we go. So common bond document covenants, as Blake said, oftentimes what we're seeing, at least today, is we're seeing energy as a service transaction owners who have existing debt, who have existing portfolios, and so those existing portfolios mean that owner is subject to probably a variety of different bond document covenants. Some of those covenants that can be critical here and that can be implicated in some of the transactions as we've seen them are things like limitations on your ability to transfer an asset. I think as you saw with one of the transactions that we've done, there was a lease of certain facilities, and so really trying to take a look at the master trust indenture to understand what that owner's ability was to lease facilities and or divest assets. That's where it will often come in under the MTI. Taking a look at that and making sure, as Chris said, that you might be able to get over the hurdle of the tax challenges, but you might still have some MTI challenges around. Another piece that we get concerned about is to the extent that the owner is bringing money in, they might want to use that money for kind of any purpose, but it could be that their master trust indenture might actually put some limitations around what types of uses those funds can be put to. So again, it's important to dig into existing debt documents and understand what the limitations are. And some of that will help to inform the way that you structure the transaction and kind of which of the in the spectrum of control options, for example, where you fall in that spectrum. So understanding that is, I think pretty critical. Matt touched a little bit on the bankruptcy concern or the bankruptcy analysis in terms of kind of intercreditor issues as between existing secured bondholders and investors and these new investors in this energy as a service transaction. It's important to understand where each of those universes of investors are going to sit in terms of being secured creditors, because there are questions that come up with respect to that. I think it probably makes sense for us to move into slide 19 and have Chaz chime in.
Yeah, actually, you know what I'd like to do, since we are kind of running out of time, a lot of good stuff to talk about here. We've covered a fair amount in the next few slides. If you don't mind going, Matt, all the way to 24. For sure there's questions around, okay, exactly how, one, do these transactions work overall? And two, how are they different if they're taxable versus tax exempt? And we talked a decent amount about that. And I think, the sort of real quick takeaway from that is, well, okay, there are some elements that are different. They're not really all that significant, kind of in the way that we've seen our clients deal with them. Why wouldn't we always do this on a tax exempt basis? And, there might be any number of reasons, but what this slide does is it really focuses on kind of that question. And actually, I'll talk about this for a second, but Chris, I was kind of hoping you might be willing to chime in here too. But some of these things we've hit on, right? If you go tax exempt, maybe there's no need to defease existing bonds for some sort of tax change in use reason. If we have taxable versus tax exempt financing, your borrowing costs are different and presumably materially lower with tax exempt. You may make a different decision on taxable, tax exempt if you're looking at tax credits, as Matt was kind of filling in the blanks a little bit before. You want to maximize your tax credits. You may want to use taxable debt for the tax credit eligible aspects. But one of the things that is true here is we're going to have ownership of the assets with a nonprofit. We're not going to be transferring ownership to a for-profit entity. So we're giving up depreciation deductions. And I realize I've only left you a minute, Chris, but I know that you've kind of looked sort of carefully at some of this comparison. And I was wondering if you might be able to kind of close us out with a little bit of that.
Yeah, no, certainly. Thanks, Chaz. And I think what we typically find, unfortunately, the answer is you have to do all the math and look at all of the various components of the value of the depreciation, tax credits, even depending on market conditions and whether tax-exempt investors are preferring high premium bonds that may provide refunding optionality, but might cost more in the near term versus par price taxable bonds. All of those machinations we find are really critical in the evaluation. And one of the approaches we have found when we have worked with asset owners in evaluating these transactions, and particularly if procuring these transactions, is to provide flexibility so that you don't force your partner to say, you have to do this or you have to do that. You find the solution that both fits within your requirements, but gets you the lowest total cost of ownership based on the market conditions at the time you're implementing the transaction. Yeah, definitely.
So with that, we are actually at the top of the hour. I want to thank you all so much for sharing your insights with us today. And I want to thank the audience for joining us. I hope you found this valuable. I'd also especially like to thank Orrick. And on behalf of the bond buyer and Orrick, we wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.